I watched my mother walk through the door holding a cake with 3 names written across it. She was smiling, sure she had already won. Her eyes swept the room once, looking for something that would never be there. Then her face changed. All the color left it within seconds. 6 weeks earlier, she told me my son would share his birthday with his cousins. She never asked me. She just decided. What she saw instead was nothing she had planned for. It was not what she wanted. My name is Odalis. I am 40 years old and I live in Fort Wayne, Indiana, with my husband and our son. What I am about to tell you happened on my son's 13th birthday, a day that should have belonged to him and to no one else. For most of his life, my mother has treated my brother's children as the ones who come first in this family. For years, I told myself I was imagining it, that I was keeping score over things that did not really matter. This time was different. This time, my mother decided that my son's birthday, the one day that was supposed to be entirely his, would become a chance to make up for something that had nothing to do with him. She never asked me if that was all right. She informed me it was happening and expected me to agree without any pushback. I am not telling you this story to make my mother look cruel or to turn my family into something for strangers to judge. I am telling it because I know there are other parents right now watching someone they love get pushed aside for someone else, staying quiet because that is what they have always done in their own families. If that sounds familiar to you, I want you to know you are not the only one carrying that weight around. Before I go back to where this all started, I would love to know where you are watching from tonight. Type your city or your state in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. If stories about families and the things we carry inside them mean something to you, this is a good time to press the like button and subscribe to this channel, so the next story finds you the moment it goes up. It genuinely helps more than you might think, and it lets me know I should keep telling these. Now let me take you back to where all of this actually began, several years before anyone in my family had ever heard of a birthday split in half. To understand my mother, you have to understand that this did not start with the grandchildren. It started with my brother Dean and me, back when we were the only 2 children in the family and there was nobody else for her attention to be divided between. When Dean turned 16, our parents bought him a used car, a plain sedan with a little rust along the wheel wells, nothing fancy, but it ran, and it meant he never had to ask anyone for a ride for the rest of high school. 2 years later, when I turned 18, I did not get a car. I got an envelope with some cash inside and a suggestion that I save up and buy one myself when I could afford it. I remember asking my mother, carefully, why my situation had turned out differently than my brother's. She told me boys needed more independence at that age than girls did, and that I would understand once I was older. I am 40 years old now, and I still do not understand it. At the time, I told myself there was probably a reasonable explanation I was not seeing. Maybe money was tighter by the time I turned 18. Maybe Dean needed it more because of his part-time job at the hardware store that summer. I did not let myself think too hard about why the reasoning only ever seemed to point in the same direction, toward whatever made things easier for him. That pattern did not disappear once Dean and I grew up and had children of our own. It simply moved to the next generation, and it got easier to explain away, because now there were 2 sets of children involved instead of 2 adult siblings, and it is much harder to accuse someone of playing favorites among grandchildren than it is among her own son and daughter. Nobody wants to be the person who says out loud that their mother loves one set of grandchildren more than the other. It sounds petty even as the words are leaving your mouth. I know that because I avoided saying it out loud myself for years. The first time I really noticed it happening to Julian, he was 6 years old. He had a kindergarten graduation that spring, the kind of small ceremony a school puts on so parents can watch their children walk across a little stage in front of rows of folding chairs. I told my mother about it a month in advance, the same way I told her about everything important, because she liked having the date written down somewhere she could see it. She said she would be there without hesitation. 3 days before the ceremony, she called to say she could not make it after all, because she had already agreed to take Beckett, who was 3 at the time, to a routine checkup with his pediatrician. It was not an emergency visit. It was the kind of appointment that gets rescheduled all the time for a dozen different reasons, The same kind I have rescheduled for Julian plenty of times myself over the years without anyone in my family thinking twice about it. I asked her if Renata could take Beckett instead, just that once, since I had told her about the ceremony so far ahead of time. She said Renata already had plans that morning, and it was easier for her to just go herself. I recorded the ceremony on my phone that day and sent it to her that same afternoon, thinking she would still want to see her grandson in his little cap, even if she could not be there in person to watch it happen. She replied a few hours later with a single short line about how sweet he looked, and nothing else. No apology. No mention of coming to the next one. That night, I sat on the edge of my son's bed after he fell asleep and told myself that one missed graduation did not mean anything in the larger scheme of things. Grandparents have their own schedules to manage, I told myself. It was an easy thing to believe when it was only one event standing on its own, without anything else attached to it yet. It was much harder to believe 2 years later, when Julian turned 8. We were all together for a family gathering that summer, one of those afternoons when everyone brings a dish to share, and the kids run around outside until somebody calls them in for cake. My mother had brought gifts for both boys, since their birthdays fell in the same month that year, only a couple weeks apart from each other. She handed Beckett, who had just turned 5, a remote control car with real working headlights and a rechargeable battery, the kind of toy that runs around $150 if you look it up. Beckett tore the wrapping paper off immediately and started driving it across the patio, thrilled with himself. Then my mother handed Julian a card. Inside was a gift card worth $20. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Renata, my sister-in-law, glanced at both gifts sitting side by side on the table and mentioned, gently, that there seemed to be a bit of a gap this year. My mother waved a hand and said boys that age like different things, as if that explained why one gift cost 7 times more than the other. Julian was 8 years old. He was not confused about what had just happened. He looked down at his card, said thank you quietly, and went back to playing without another word about it. I caught Grant's eye across the yard and knew, without either of us saying anything out loud, that we were both thinking the exact same thing. I remember thinking that Julian had learned something that day I wished he never had to learn, something about which grandchild mattered more, and that no apology afterward was going to undo it now that he already knew. The pattern kept going. When Julian was 10, my mother started a new tradition. Every year she took Ren, who was 4 at the time, and Beckett, who was 7, to a water park resort about 2 hours from here, the kind of place with an attached hotel, so the trip became an entire weekend away instead of a single afternoon. She never once invited Julian. Not the first year, not the second. Each time she came back, she posted photographs online of the two of them by the pool, smiling, and each time Julian saw those photographs on the family group chat before I had a chance to say anything to him about it first. I remember him asking her directly, during a phone call the second year, if he could come along the next time she took his cousins. There was a pause on the line before she answered. She told him maybe next time, in a tone that did not invite any follow-up questions. She did not mean it, and next time never came. Julian stopped asking after that. He never brought it up again, not even with me, and that silence bothered me more than any complaint from him would have. A child who stops asking has usually already answered the question for himself, quietly, without needing anyone to say it out loud for him. At the time Julian was 11, I had watched enough of this add up that I finally said something directly to my mother. I called her one evening after Julian had gone to bed and went through it, one thing after another, the graduation, the gift cards, the water park trips he was never invited to. I kept my voice calm. I was not trying to start a fight. I was trying to be heard, which felt like a small enough thing to ask for after 11 years of noticing this pattern and saying nothing about it. She did not hear me. She told me I was keeping score, that I had always been too sensitive about these things, that families do not need to divide everything equally to prove they love each other. I told her this was never about equal, that I did not care whether the gifts matched in price, that this was about Julian being included even once in something the other two got to do every single year. She told me I was causing division in the family by bringing all of this up years after any of it happened, as though the passage of time made the pattern less true instead of more obvious. She ended the call before I had finished talking. I sat in my kitchen afterward for a long time, staring at the phone in my hand, wondering if I had imagined the entire conversation, because nothing about it had gone the way I hoped it would. About a year ago, I watched my father witness one of these moments firsthand. We were at another family gathering, and my mother had just canceled plans she had made with Julian, a promise to take him for ice cream after everyone finished eating, because she needed to leave early to help Ren and Beckett get ready for a school event of theirs that same evening. Julian did not make a scene about it. He simply nodded and went to find his cousins in the living room, the way he always did when something like this happened, putting the disappointment away where nobody could see it on his face. My father pulled me aside afterward, out by the driveway where nobody else could hear us. He told me he knew what was happening. He said it low, almost like a confession, like he had been holding on to the observation for a long time and finally needed somewhere to put it down. Then he said it was easier to let it go, that my mother had always been like this, and that trying to change her at this point in her life was not worth the trouble it would cause. I asked him directly if he thought it was fair to Julian. He did not answer that question. He only repeated that it was easier this way and went back inside before I could push any further. I stood there in the driveway by myself for a minute and understood, for the first time clearly, that his silence was not neutral. He was not standing outside of what was happening to my son, watching it happen from a distance the way a person watches something that has nothing to do with them. He was choosing, every single time, not to say anything, and that choice was its own answer, one he had been giving for years without ever having to say it out loud. By the time all of this had built up, I had stopped expecting my mother to treat Julian fairly. I stopped waiting for the year she would finally invite him to the water park, or match the value of a gift, or show up to something of his without something else pulling her away at the last minute. Instead, I quietly built a different kind of safety for my son, inside our own home, inside the small circle of people who did show up for him consistently, people like Grant's mother, Corrine, who never once missed a single thing of Julian's in his entire life. I was not fighting for fairness from my mother anymore. I had simply stopped needing it from her, because I had found enough of it elsewhere to fill in what she left empty. That is exactly why what happened next, the conversation about his 13th birthday, hit differently than anything before it. It was not a new kind of unfairness. It was the same pattern wearing a different date, except this time it was not about a gift card or a missed graduation or a trip he was never invited on. This time it was about the one day of the year that was supposed to belong to him completely, and even that, my mother decided, was something she believed she had the right to divide. The Sunday in question was an ordinary one, the first weekend of August. My parents came over for dinner the way they usually did every couple of weeks. Grant made dinner in the backyard. Julian sat inside working on a puzzle with his grandfather at the kitchen table, the two of them arguing lightly about which corner piece went where. And nothing about the evening suggested it would be any different from any other Sunday we had spent together that summer. We were sitting around the table after dinner, plates mostly empty, when my mother set down her glass and said she wanted to talk to us about something. For a moment, I thought she was about to bring up a schedule conflict for an upcoming holiday, or a question about where we would spend Thanksgiving that year, since that conversation usually started sometime in August in our family. I was not prepared for what came next. She told us that Ren and Beckett had gone through a hard year. She was not wrong about that part. Dean had lost his job back in February, right around Beckett's birthday, and the family had to move into a smaller rental a few weeks later, right around the time Ren turned 7. Both of their birthdays had come and gone with barely any celebration. The family was in the middle of moving and job searching, and birthdays were simply not the priority that year. I felt for Dean and Renata all spring. I still do, and nothing about what happened later changes that. Then my mother said the part that changed everything. She said that since the cousins had been so upset about missing their birthdays, the family was going to celebrate them again, properly this time, right at Julian's party. She said Julian could share one day. She did not ask if this was all right with me. She stated it the way you state something already decided, something the rest of us were simply being informed about after the fact. I sat there for a second, trying to process what she had actually said. Then I asked, as calmly as I could manage, whether we could instead plan something separate for Ren and Beckett, maybe the following weekend, so both celebrations could get the attention they deserved without folding one into the other. It felt like a reasonable question to ask out loud at my own kitchen table. My mother's response was to list, one by one, everything she felt she had sacrificed for this family over the years. The time she spent helping Dean and Renata get back on their feet after he lost his job. The weekends she gave up so someone could always be available if the kids needed watching. The energy she put into keeping everyone close, into organizing every holiday, into being the one who remembered everyone's schedules when nobody else seemed to bother. The implication, never stated outright but perfectly clear to everyone at that table, was that I was being selfish for wanting my own son's birthday to simply belong to him. I asked her, once more, whether the issue was really the date itself, or whether there was a reason it had to be this specific party instead of any other weekend on the calendar. She said the venue was already halfway booked in her mind, that it made sense to combine things since everyone would already be gathered in one place, that it would save everyone the trouble of getting together twice in 1 month. Efficiency, in other words, mattered more to her in that moment than whether my son got to keep his own birthday intact. I looked over at my father during all of this, half expecting him to say something, to back me up the way I had hoped he might after our conversation in the driveway the year before. He did not look up from his phone. He did not say a single word, not in my defense, not in hers. His silence filled the room more than anything either of us had said out loud. I understood, sitting there, that arguing further was not going to change anything. I had tried that already, 2 years earlier over the phone, and it had ended with her accusing me of causing division in the family. I knew exactly how this conversation would go if I kept pushing, word for word, because I had already heard it once before. So I stopped. I said something like, "Fine, whatever you think is best," and let the subject drop. My mother smiled. She thought she had won. What she did not know, what nobody at that table knew, was what was actually happening inside me in that exact moment. It was not resignation. It was something closing, quietly and completely, somewhere she could not see, I thought. With a clarity I had never felt before in any conversation with her, that I was never going to ask my mother's permission for anything involving my son again. Not for a birthday, not for a holiday, not for anything at all. That decision did not arrive with anger. It arrived with a settled calm. I had stopped waiting for something that was never going to happen, and stopping brought relief instead of grief. That night, after my parents had gone home and Julian was asleep, I told Grant everything, in order, exactly as it happened. He listened without interrupting, the way he always does when something actually matters. When I finished, he asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I did not want a confrontation. I did not want to spend the next 6 weeks arguing with my mother about a party that was supposed to be a celebration in the first place. What I wanted was for Julian to have a real 13th birthday, one that belonged entirely to him, and I did not need my mother's permission or her presence to make that happen. We decided that night that we would quietly plan a separate party, a real one, and that we would not tell my mother anything had changed. Not to trick her, and not out of spite. I was simply done negotiating for my son's right to have one day that was his. A few days later, I sat down with Julian at the kitchen table and explained what my mother had proposed, and what Grant and I were thinking of doing instead. I watched his face carefully while I talked, worried he might be upset or confused by any of it. He was not surprised the way I expected him to be. He brought up the water park trips, the ones he was never invited to, and said he had figured out a long time ago that his grandmother treated Ren and Beckett differently than she treated him. He had just never said anything about it, because he did not think saying something would actually change anything. I asked him directly what he actually wanted for his birthday, if he could have exactly what he wanted with no restrictions at all. Nobody had ever really asked him that question in a way that expected a real answer back. He sat up straighter in his chair and told me he wanted a basketball party at Summit City Sports Center, the indoor facility across town with the full courts, with his close friends there, especially Marcus, who had been his best friend since 3rd grade. He wanted to actually play, not sit in a rented hall in a folding chair and watch the adults talk to each other over his head. Over the following 2 weeks, I put my job to good use. I coordinate freight logistics for a living, which mostly means I spend my days negotiating schedules and finding room where there does not seem to be any room left. Summit City Sports Center was almost completely booked for the month, but after several calls and one conversation with a scheduling manager who finally took pity on me, I secured a court for a Saturday morning instead of the afternoon slot Julian had first wanted. It turned out to work even better, since it left the whole rest of the day still ahead of him once the party ended, instead of tapering into evening. Grant took charge of the real guest list. He reached out to the parents of Julian's close friends, to his own side of the family, including his mother Corrine, who had never once missed anything of Julian's, and to a handful of family friends who had always shown up for our son consistently, without needing to be asked twice or reminded a week later. About 3 weeks before the party, my mother called to check on the preparations at Cedarview Hall, the venue she believed we were still using. She mentioned she had already told Wren and Beckett about the celebration, and that she had ordered a cake with all 3 of their names written across the top. She asked what time she should tell everyone to arrive. I answered vaguely. I did not confirm anything about Cedarview Hall, and I did not deny anything either. I told her I would sort out the details later and send everyone the final time, which was true in its own way, just not in the way she assumed. During that same stretch of time, Renata reached out to me privately, texting first to ask if I had a few minutes to talk. She told me she had been thinking about the whole situation, and that she did not think it was fair to Julian either, but that she felt stuck, unsure how to say anything without starting a fight with her mother-in-law. I listened carefully. I appreciated her honesty more than I expected to, given that she had every reason to just stay quiet and let it play out. I did not tell her what Grant and I were actually planning. I only said we would see how things played out, which, again, was technically true, even if it left out almost everything that mattered. Around that same time, Dean sent me a short text thanking me for being so understanding about sharing Julian's birthday with his kids. He had no idea what was actually happening behind the scenes. Reading that message, I felt something between guilt and a quiet vindication, knowing how differently things were about to unfold from what he imagined sitting on the other end of that phone. In the final week before the party, everything came together. We ordered a basketball-themed banner with Julian's name on it, nobody else's, and a separate cake decorated with a basketball court design instead of anything generic. We confirmed the guest list one more time with everyone who was actually coming, checking names off a list on the refrigerator the way we always did before anything important. The night before the party, lying in bed, a wave of nerves crept in. I wondered if we were making the right call, if this would turn into something worse than the party itself, something that would follow Julian around for years. Grant reached over and told me this was the right decision, that we were not doing anything wrong, that we were simply making sure our son got the birthday he deserved after years of watching him get less than that. I fell asleep more certain than I had felt in weeks. The Saturday of Julian's birthday arrived warm and clear. By 9 a.m, Summit City Sports Center was already filling with the sound of sneakers on hardwood and the noise of a group of 13-year-old boys let loose on an entire basketball court with nothing but time ahead of them. The banner above the check-in desk read Julian's name and nothing else. The table along the side wall held the basketball-themed cake, along with trays of food Grant and I had prepared the evening before. Marcus arrived first, the way best friends usually do, followed steadily by the rest of Julian's close group of friends, each one greeted at the door by Grant with the same easy welcome. Grant's mother, Corrine, arrived not long after, along with the rest of Grant's side of the family, every one of them there because they wanted to be, not because anyone had asked twice. At that same hour across town, my mother, my father, Dean, Renata, and the 2 kids arrived at Cedarview Hall right on schedule, carrying a cake with 3 names written across the top and gift bags for Wren and Beckett tucked under Renata's arm. They found the doors locked. There was no sign posted, no staff waiting, nothing to suggest any event was happening there that morning. My mother called my phone several times in a row. I did not answer. I had put my phone on silent that morning on purpose, wanting nothing to distract from Julian's actual day, not even for a moment. A building manager happened to walk through the lobby, and stopped when he saw the group standing outside the locked doors, looking increasingly confused. He told them there was no event booked under our name for that day, and mentioned that the earlier inquiry my mother had made about the space had never been finalized with an actual payment or a signed contract. My mother had assumed the booking was set simply because she had asked about it once, without ever confirming the actual details with me directly afterward. The group stood there for a moment, uncertain what to do next, gift bags still in hand. It was Dean who finally suggested calling Grant. Grant's phone rang while he stood near the food table, watching Julian dribble a basketball across the court with Marcus chasing after him, both of them laughing about something neither of us would ever fully hear the details of. He stepped away to answer, glancing back once at our son laughing in the middle of the court before he picked up. After listening for a moment, he sent me a quick message asking whether he should give them the real address. I read it standing near the cake table, and after a short pause, I told him to go ahead and tell her. There was no version of this where I wanted to keep Julian's location a secret forever. I only wanted my mother to understand, once and for all, that this particular day did not belong to her to plan. Grant read the address for Summit City Sports Center out loud over the phone. On the other end, there was a long pause before anyone said anything back. It took my mother's group about 15 or 20 minutes to drive across town. By the time they walked through the doors, Julian's friendly game with his friends had just wrapped up, and the room was still loud with laughter over an easy shot somebody had missed twice before finally making it on the third try. My mother walked in first, still holding the cake box with 3 names written across the top in careful icing. Her eyes moved across the room once, searching for anything that matched what she had expected to see. There was no sign of Cedarview Hall's rented tables, no sign of Wren or Beckett's names anywhere, no sign that her plan had ever existed in this room at all. The noise near the entrance started to drop as people noticed them standing there. Julian, still catching his breath from the game, looked up and saw his grandmother standing in the doorway with the cake box still in her hands. My mother asked what was going on, where everything was, her voice caught somewhere between confusion and the beginning of understanding. Julian did not raise his voice. He set the basketball down on the floor beside him and told her calmly that this was his day. Only his. Grant stepped forward and explained, briefly and without any edge in his voice, that we had changed the plan because we wanted Julian to have a birthday that actually belonged to him. My mother tried to explain herself, repeating what she had said weeks earlier at our dinner table, that Wren and Beckett had gone through such a hard year, that they deserved a real celebration too. Nobody in the room argued that particular point. That was never what this was about, and on some level I think everyone standing there understood that plainly enough. Then Renata spoke up, and I could tell from her own expression that she surprised herself as much as she surprised everyone else standing in that room. She said, quietly but clearly, that she had thought the plan was wrong from the very beginning, and that she had been too afraid of causing conflict with her mother-in-law to say so out loud until this exact moment. Dean did not defend his mother. He said nothing in her favor at all. He simply nodded, once in agreement with his wife, his eyes fixed somewhere on the floor between them. My mother looked at Renata, then at Dean, then at my father, waiting for one of them to agree with her. In the past, that agreement always came automatically, without her even having to ask for it out loud. This time nobody gave it to her. That was the moment her face lost every bit of color. Her grip on the cake box loosened. She seemed to forget for a moment that she was holding it at all, and the box tilted slightly before Octavius reached out and steadied it for her. She stood frozen for what felt like a long time, though it was probably only a few seconds. My father, who had said almost nothing this entire time, finally moved. He touched her arm and guided her back toward the doors, away from the party that was never going to include her plan, no matter how long she stood there. Wren and Beckett stood near the entrance, confused and visibly disappointed, since they had been told for weeks that they would get a proper celebration that day. Beckett asked, in the small voice a 10-year-old uses when he does not fully understand what has just happened, whether they were still going to get their party. Renata knelt beside them and explained, gently, that the family would plan something just for the two of them soon, a real celebration, one that belonged only to them and did not need to be attached to anybody else's special day. The two kids nodded, still unsure, but calmer than they had been a moment before. The party continued. Julian spent the rest of that morning exactly the way he had wanted to spend it, surrounded by people who had shown up because they wanted to be there, playing basketball with his closest friends on a court that had nothing to do with Ren and Beckett's birthdays or anyone else's plans for the day. In the days that followed, my mother called several times. I let most of those calls go unanswered at first, not out of spite, but because I needed distance before I could have that conversation without it turning into another version of the same argument we had already had twice before. When I finally picked up, a few days later, I kept my voice steady. I told her I was not trying to cut her or my father out of Julian's life. I told her that decisions about my son, from now on, belonged to Grant and me, not to her to arrange on her own and inform us about afterward. She responded somewhere between acknowledgement and continued justification, saying she only wanted to do something good for Ren and Beckett, that she never expected any of it to turn into what it became that morning. A few weeks later, at a smaller family gathering, one of my aunts, who had heard some version of the story through the usual channels families used to pass things around, brought it up in an awkward, half-joking way, clearly not realizing how raw the subject still was for everyone involved. She asked my mother, in front of several people standing near the kitchen island, whether it was true that she had shown up at the wrong party with a cake nobody used. My mother gave a short, clipped answer and changed the subject as quickly as she could. I watched her face during that exchange. It was the first time I saw her sit with the fact that her version of events was no longer the only version anyone believed, because too many people had already witnessed what actually happened that morning at Summit City Sports Center with their own eyes. Around that same time, Renata and I met for coffee, just the two of us, something we had never really done before on our own. She told me, more directly than before, that she had wanted to say something the moment my mother first brought up the shared birthday idea, but that she had been afraid of what it might do to her relationship with her mother-in-law, especially with Dean still rebuilding things after losing his job. I listened without judgment. I understood that fear more than she probably realized, since I had spent years avoiding the exact same kind of confrontation myself. After that conversation, something between us shifted. We grew closer than we had been before, and Renata became more careful, without me ever having to ask her to be, about making sure Ren and Beckett's activities never landed on top of something important to Julian again. Dean and I also had our own conversation, separate from Renata's, over the phone one evening after the kids were asleep. He admitted, in a way I had not expected from him, that he had let our mother's favoritism continue for years because it benefited his own kids, and that he understood now how that silence had affected Julian on the other side of it. He apologized plainly, without making excuses halfway through the way he usually did. I did not pretend the apology erased years of watching him stay quiet while his children received things mine never did. I recognized it for what it was, a real step, and I told him so before we hung up. My mother, over the following months, made small adjustments, the kind that came without announcement or explanation attached to them. One Saturday, she showed up to one of Julian's basketball games without anyone reminding her it was happening. She did not make a speech about it or ask for credit for showing up. She sat in the stands and watched the whole game, quietly, the way any grandparent might on an ordinary weekend. My father remained mostly unchanged. The closest he came to acknowledging any of it was a single comment, something about how his wife meant well. She just did not think things through sometimes. He still had not truly reckoned with his own part in all of it, the years of silence in driveways and at dinner tables, choosing comfort over honesty every single time it came up. As for Ren and Beckett, Dean and Renata eventually organized a proper belated birthday celebration for both of them, entirely their own, with nothing borrowed from anyone else's day. Julian and I were invited, and we went, and we meant it. Whatever had happened between the adults in this family, none of it was those two children's fault. They deserved their own celebration just as much as Julian deserved his, and watching them finally get it, done the way it should have been done from the very start, closed something in me that had been sitting open for a long time. A few months have passed since that morning at Summit City Sports Center. Family gatherings still happen. We still see each other at holidays, at the occasional Sunday dinner. At the small events that make up a family's ordinary calendar throughout the year. Everyone is polite. Everyone shows up when they say they will. But something that used to sit underneath all of it, a closeness I used to take for granted without thinking twice about it, has not come back the way I once hoped it might. I do not regret what we did. I have turned it over in my mind more times than I can count, at the kitchen sink, in the car, lying awake some nights, and I keep arriving at the same place. My relationship with my mother is never going to look the way I once wanted it to look. I have made my peace with that, or at least I am closer to peace with it than I was 6 weeks after the party. What I am certain of, without any hesitation at all, is that protecting my son's right to one single day that belonged entirely to him was worth whatever it cost me with her. A few evenings ago, I stood on our porch and watched Julian practice free throws in the driveway as the sky went dark around him. Grant stood a few feet away, catching the ball each time it bounced off the rim and passing it back without either of them needing to say much. Julian missed a few, made a few, laughed once when the ball rolled all the way to the curb and he had to jog down to chase it. Nobody was performing anything for anyone. It was an ordinary evening, the kind that felt impossible to imagine 6 weeks earlier, when I was still bracing for an argument that never actually needed to happen the way I feared it would. I have learned something this year that I think a lot of people already know somewhere inside themselves, even if they have not had to face it directly yet. Protecting someone you love sometimes means disappointing someone else you also love. That is its own kind of loss, a quiet one, without a clear ending you can point to and say, there, it is finally over. I am still learning how to carry that. But if I had to make the same choice again, knowing everything I know now, I would make it exactly the same way, every single time. If any part of this reminded you of something in your own family, I would really love to hear about it. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my position, and whether you think a birthday deserves to stay exactly whose it is, no matter what else is going on around it. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to like this video, subscribe if you have not already, and share it with anyone you think might need to hear it today. It helps this channel more than you know, and it helps stories like this one reach the people who actually need to hear them. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and with my family tonight. I hope wherever you are watching from, you are surrounded by people who show up for you the way you deserve, without you ever having to ask them twice. And I hope your own celebrations, big or small, always stay exactly yours. I will see you in the next story.